everybody, I'm Kombucha Kev, and in this video I'll be walking you through how to keg a batch of kombucha. So if you saw my previous two videos, I first started off showing you the process of brewing a batch of kombucha. Second video went over the flavoring and secondary fermentation. And this video is picking up where that left off, and I'll be going through the process of putting the kombucha in the keg and then carbonating it so that you can dispense it on tap. Alright, so now I have my keg ready and my kombucha is ready to pour into the keg. One thing I use is a funnel with a filter mesh on it just to catch any of that fruit or particles that might come through. So I'm going to put that down there, and then I'll also take off the lid that I use for the secondary fermentation. If I didn't do that and I started drawing, it would start pulling the star sand I had in my airlock into the brew, which wouldn't really affect anything, but I'd prefer to not have that in there. So yeah, this looks good and ready to go. So basically I'll just open up my faucet and let it fill the keg up. If you're worried about splashback or anything, you can also attach a rubber hose into the funnel here just to prevent it from dropping down and splashing. So we'll just let this go. It'll take a few minutes. Alright, so we have our full keg of kombucha. Next step is to close it off, which these lids can be a little tricky to get in, but I found what works best is to stick the end with this release valve in first. Make sure it passes through, and then kind of turn and pivot it. And then I try to make sure it's nice and flush. And then I want this release valve to pull through so that it's sitting above this handle. So I do that. I'm just going to wipe this down a little bit. I try to fill it as close to the top as I can, just so I don't have a lot of extra air in there, which once I hook it up to CO2, I'll try to purge some of that out too. But that's our keg of kombucha. The one thing I recommend is, if you mess with this release valve, to kind of turn it a little bit clockwise, like a quarter, if you can. Sometimes if you pull it, it can get kind of lodged in a place where it's not fully closed. And then when you hook it up to the CO2, it'll spray some out. So if you try to turn it, sometimes you hear a little bit of a pop, but you should get that resistance, and that way you'll know it's closed all the way. So that's the keg of kombucha. Let's move over to the kegerator now to hook it up. All right, so here is the inside of my kegerator. First thing I'm going to do is put back my CO2 tank and regulator that I took out earlier. So mine has a little bit of a cradle back here that I could put it in. I then take this bolt and nut and just loosely thread it in this bracket, just so it doesn't move around at all. Then I'm going to take my CO2 hose coming out of the regulator and put it directly onto the carbonation lid I talked about earlier. If you don't have this lid, you'll just put it on the post that says out or in, since we're putting the CO2 in. So now I have the CO2 hose on. Now I'm going to open up my CO2 tank and turn the regulator on. I'm also going to hook up the other keg I have in here. I took it off because I was going to do the demonstration of, removing the CO2 tank and hooking it up again. So I'm going to put this one back on. This is my keg of pine needle tea I brewed pretty recently. Check out that recipe if you haven't already. But generally, with the new keg of kombucha, I'll set the CO2 up a little high, like 15 or 20 psi. After it's had a chance to carbonate, usually overnight, by tomorrow morning, I'll dip it down to 5 to 8 psi, which is more of a serving psi. So I have this set up a little high right now just for this first night. And then the last piece here is to put on the hose out. So this will be the hose the kombucha comes out of and come out through the faucet at the top. So I'm just trying to see which one says out, which is this one. And these basically, they open those balls on the inside for the ball lock, and you can push down and then release, and then push that coupling down to lock it. So my hoses are a little long in here, but I'm going to try to make room so that this keg will fit in nicely. So that's all the steps for kegging the kombucha. I always like to test it real quick just to see, make sure it flows out okay. Which I'll take a shot up here. So there's the kombucha I just kegged. Like I said, I'm going to let this go overnight so that it carbonates more fully. I mean, as you see, this is already pretty much dissipated. It's pretty flat looking. So I'll do a little video in the morning once it's had a chance to carbonate a bit. All right, so I let my kombucha carbonate a couple days. One thing I forgot to mention is I like to pull the valve at the top of the keg lid as I'm carbonating it, just a little bit, just so I can get that excess air out, and the hopes that more CO2 will pump in, and I'll end up pushing out that air. So, like I said, I start the PSI up a little bit high, and then I reduce it to more of a serving PSI after that day or so. So I'm gonna go pour some and see how it looks. And there we go. Yeah, that looks great to me. I like to have just a little bit of head on the top, and it's not overly foamy, but there's still a little bit in there. So yeah, it looks great to me. I'm happy with those results. So hopefully this video helped you, and feel free to subscribe if you want to see some more videos I'll be making.